Next one up, we have Mr. William Collier. So when it comes to the seriously big yachts from the past, I think William Collier is the world's most sought-after expert. The only person on planet, actually, we just heard this one, who managed to convince his professors to allow his PhD to be on the history of yacht design. Is that true? Next, his life became one of the saving old boats from the mud pits and boneyards, and a life of figuring out how to bring them back to life, and of course the former glory. A life of research and restoration and preservation. And most recently, the founder of the Scottish Yachting Archives. This unique collection is in Glasgow, reveals the story and images we will probably see very shortly. But today, William will take us back into when the maxis were truly the maxis. So, welcome, William Collier.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. It's great to be back here. Wonderful event, and I'm never going to miss an edition. So what I wanted to talk to you about is the generation before the J-Class. Everyone's seen the J-Class thanks to their revival, but we don't know where these big boats came from. So today I'm going to be talking about the 30 years up to the First World War, succession of rules, 9 America's Cup challenges, and we're going to go quite fast, because I only have 25 minutes. So in the mid-1870s, yacht racing in Britain was based around yacht clubs. There were many different rules, and all of the rules essentially were based on the old customs house rules, which is how they charged for places in ports, based on commercial vessels. We had relatively small boats, no big cutters yet. The leading yacht designer at the time was William Fife II, father of the more famous William Fife III. His winning boat in the mid-1870s was the 40-tonner Bloodhound, and that was pretty well state-of-the-art. But in the mid-1870s, things start to change. We have a generation of young insurgents coming in, such as J.L. Watson and the slightly younger William Fife III. And both of these guys made their names by designing small racing yachts. Vril, which you can see here, is the yacht that really made Watson's career, but he didn't have any money and he didn't have any clients, but he had friends. So he and 2 other friends built this boat to his design in the corner of a friendly shipyard. They had 2 professional carpenters working for them, and they went out in the next summer, and they pretty well dominated the 5-tonner class, which was the hot class at the time. Watson's career, of course, was short, but it was pretty amazing. Over 30 years, he launched a boat every 3.5 weeks to his design, so we can understand how he died of exhaustion, aged only 53. This drawing here was prepared by J.L. Watson to show the comparison of all his America's Cup challenges. There's 5 of them designed, only 4 of them were built, but you can see a relatively conventional design at the top for an 1886 Challenger, then Thistle in 1887 with a cutaway underwater body. In the middle, Valkyrie II, which is very similar to Britannia, a kind of ideal, beautiful, balanced shape. And then we get the out-and-out Sawanica rule boats, such as Valkyrie III and ultimately Shamrock II. Well, what was going on in the 1870s was that the yacht owners got together and they decided that they needed to have more control of their sport, and they needed a national body. So in 1875, they created the Yacht Racing Association, and gradually this harmonized racing across the UK. Lots of people didn't like it, so we get the emergence of 1 design classes, and we even have a yacht as late as 1899 called No YRA in protest at the national body. We didn't like it. But anyway, they came up with a first rule in 1881. And I'm not going to go into lots of formulas, but the important thing here is to look at B. B is beam, and B is everywhere in this formula, and this would lead to serious problems. Apart from the old established designers like the second Fife and the young insurgents, there is a generation of established middle-aged designers who are pretty conventional. And by this I mean people like Alexander Richardson, and I'm going to talk about James Beaver Webb. In 1884, he got the commission to design 2 America's Cup challenges. And the idea was that Genesta the first would challenge, and if she wasn't successful, Galatea would follow. And you can see Galatea here. She's an all-steel boat, not terribly successful, not as good as Genesta, because I think she was just way too heavy, because steel construction in yachts was pretty well at its infancy. But the important thing about this challenge is it was negotiated by the designer on behalf of the 2 owners, and when they came to how they would rate the yachts, he'd given no thought to it. So he writes to the New York Yacht Club saying, hey, I've got a good idea. Why don't we use the English system and the New York Yacht Club system, then we'll just take an average of the 2, and that will be fair. And of course, the New York Yacht Club are having nothing of of this. So he had to accept the American rating system, or the New York Yacht Club rating system, and of course, like all British challengers, both boats lost. But whilst these kind of conventional things are going on, in the mid-1880s, people like G.L. Watson in particular are really looking at that rule and remembering that beam is incredibly highly penalized. So in 1885, Watson comes out with a boat called Doris with a waterline length to beam ratio of 6, which is extreme. But there's one younger designer who thinks he can do better, William Evans Peyton, and he designs a boat with a length to beam average of about 6.12, and that's Una. Unfortunately, Una was built on the south coast, was sailed up, well, they tried to sail her up to Scotland to go racing, and it all went horribly wrong. The boat was rolled over, she lost a keel, she lost a rig, everybody died, and the hull was washed up on a beach in Ireland. And I include this photograph to make you see just the extremities of craziness that people went to under this rule. After the Una disaster, the Yacht Racing Association realized they had to change the rating rule. This was no longer possible to carry on this direction. So they came up with the length and sail area rule. And the thing about this rule that's amazing is it's the first rule in British yachting history that actually included sail area, which you would have thought was a pretty basic thing. But at this point, nobody really wanted to build a big yacht because they'd seen what was happening and they just got intimidated by it, and the patrons for big yachting were not playing anymore. The only ones who were playing was a syndicate of Scotsmen who built another America's Cup Challenger to Watson-designed Thistle. Now, this is the first America's Cup Challenger from Britain that actually paid attention to the rule that she was supposed to race against. And that's probably the most significant thing. And of course, she failed. That will be a constant refrain in my speech today. The Americans, after this challenge with the relatively conservative New York Yacht Club rule, introduced the Sewanaka rule, or the Herreshoff rule, and this is the rule that gave us the boats culminating in Reliance, the most extreme gaff cutters ever. But after some years, the British kind of got used to the idea of big boats again, and there was an America's Cup challenge made by the Earl of Dunraven. And when he challenged with the Watson-designed Valkyrie II, he had a boat that was designed to comply both under the British rating rule and the American rating rule. And this seemed like a pretty ideal situation, and it also gave the prospect of a big racing cutter in British waters. And the Prince of Wales got excited and commissioned Britannia. Because Britannia was commissioned by the Prince of Wales, a whole bunch of people got excited. So Fife got an order, and James Soper got an order for Satanita. So suddenly we have a class of 4 big class cutters going to race in British waters. And the Americans, not to be outdone, build 4 potential defenders for the America's Cup. This is Vigilant, the Herreshoff yard. And then another one is built, Navajo, purely to come and race against the British fleet. So we have this incredibly wonderful situation of having 9 big class cutters in the world and transatlantic correspondence, and everyone is super excited. Of course, the America's Cup is an American victory. We're not even going to go into the details of the racing because it never works. But the exciting thing is we have the American Navajo come to Britain, and the British are thinking, well, we've lost the America's Cup, but maybe that's just because it's in America, we can do better in Britain. And they have an incredible series of racing over the summer of 1893, and the kind of British pride is restored because Britannia consistently beats Navajo, and this is thought to be a really great thing. So the Americans, rather spiked by that, decide to bring Vigilant to Britain in 1894 in what's widely advertised as a rerun of the America's Cup. So we're going to have Valkyrie II racing against Vigilant, but also against Satanita, Kaluna, and the whole British fleet, and of course Valkyrie II. Vigilant sails across the North Atlantic, is re-rigged into racing trim in Scotland. The first racing is going to be on the Clyde, and it all goes horribly wrong on the first race. 4 boats have entered, Satanita, Vigilant, Valkyrie, and Britannia. And at the start line is the classic incident, and this is the result of it. Satanita takes an enormous bite out of Valkyrie. She survives. Satanita is sunk. But the 2 other boats pay no attention to this, and Vigilant and Britannia race on. Britannia wins the race, and that sets the tone for the season, with Britannia dominating the America's Cup winner. So British pride at some level is restored. Lord Dunraven, whose yacht's been sunk, is far less happy about the situation and still wants to prove that he can beat the Americans. So in 1895, he builds an out-and-out Sewanaka Cup rule boat. This is Valkyrie 3, a sail tries on the Clyde. Absolutely stunning boat, takes her over to America, but of course he commits the fatal error of thinking the Americans are cheating and drags the whole cup into the mud, and eventually has to resign from the New York Yacht Club. And there is a big international controversy. Diplomatic relations between the two countries get strained, and he is out of the America's Cup, but it would take Thomas Lipton to come in and patch the whole thing back together again. But there's another thing going on, another American intervention into British yachting. Under the rule, in small yacht racing, we'd had a whole series of fin and bulb keels. So wide boats, flat bottoms, thin keels with bulbs on the end, detached rudders, the kind of boats that we would be building 100 years later once we got carbon and we had the technology to build them. And no one thought you could build big boats like this because they just simply fell apart because they didn't have good enough glue. But Herreshoff builds Niagara, and she's built to come and race in Britain, and you can see the kind of extreme shape we're talking about here. And suddenly the threat of a big fin keeler on the big class means that the YRA has to do something. So they change the rules to make it impossible for a boat like this to race. And the significant thing in this formula is the G thing, which is the girth measurement. So from waterline straight down to the keel. So if you've got a big, fat, wide boat, you have an incredibly big G measurement, and your boat won't rate well. So they get rid of these. But this opens an opportunity, because ever since Britannia has launched, the Kaiser in Germany has been watching this. He'd bought the old Thistle, America's Cup Challenger, in 1891, but he wants a winner, and he keeps on knocking on Watson's door saying, will you design me a winner? And Watson's like, I don't know what to do to beat Britannia, but there's a new rule. So Watson tells the Kaiser, he said, look, if you're really serious about this, now we have a chance. We've got a new rule. Britannia can't rate so well under it, so now is the time. And then to make doubly sure, not only does he build a boat to the new rule, but he builds an even bigger cutter. So now she's going to win on waterline, length, going too fast. Okay, try to slow down a little bit. Then you have to give me extra time. So he builds the largest gaff cutter ever built, and of course Meteor comes out, and she beats everybody to the extent that the Prince of Wales gets so bored that he sells Britannia at the end of the 1898 season, and he is out of racing. But this does promote racing for other people who want to join. But how do you beat Meteor? You can't actually build a cutter bigger than this because they don't have the technology. So what do you do? So Watson comes up with an idea. We'll build a schooner. And this is kind of the Mary Char 4 of the period. He builds Rainbow, 60 meters on deck. This is an enormous schooner, capable of speeds of over 16 knots as a sustained speed, not a peak speed. And the reason he does this is because under the rating formula, you get a discount for a schooner rig because it's considered to be less efficient. So suddenly we have a situation where we have this enormous schooner racing against gaff cutters. But then another client comes along and says, I want to win. And this is the Duke of Abruzzi, who is both the grandson of the King of Spain and of the King of Italy, so he's a pretty important guy. And Watson goes, okay, what we can do is we can build the smallest big class cutter, and we can try the handicap advantage under that. And the incredible thing about these boats is we actually have film of them racing. Let's try and play this. I believe this is the oldest film in the world of yachts racing. This is taken on the Clyde in 1899. Keep an eye on the little rowing boat here. These guys are about to get a big surprise. Later that year, Thomas Edison would make the first movie of the America's Cup, and it's not nearly as good as this. So that's Bona, the smallest big class cutter, and the mighty Rainbow. So after these successes, Watson is asked to design another challenger for the America's Cup for Sir Thomas Lipton. But the America's Cup is an enormously time-consuming endeavor, and it's also potentially and most likely an enormous loss of prestige. So Watson declines. So the order for Shamrock 1's design goes to William Fife. He designs Shamrock 1, and of course she loses. But Watson is not disinterested at this point in the big class. He just doesn't want to do the America's Cup. And he has yet another customer, Whittaker Wright, who comes to him saying, I want to win in the big class. So now he has to do something else. So he takes a little bit of the Rainbow example with a two-masted rig, so he gets a discount for having a less efficient rig, but that's not going to be enough. So now he builds an ultralight hull, a steel framework, but very, very heavily engineered, and he planks her in yellow pine. The boat's not going to last very long, but she is going to win. And she does that. But then Lipton comes back and says, you have to design the next America's Cup Challenger. It's your patriotic duty. And Watson doesn't have an answer to that. But he does have a very careful think about how he can build a winner. And he does something absolutely extraordinary. He goes and starts tank testing sailing yachts for the first time in history. Now, we'd had tank tests in Britain for quite a long time, developed by the Admiralty for warships and then for commercial ships, but they're only for towing boats in a straight line, so you can estimate the speed they'll do, or the power of the engines that you need to achieve a certain speed so that you're successful about your contract. Well, what Watson does is he realizes the boats, sailing yachts, don't move in a straight line. They have leeway. They also are not flat on the water. They heel. And he does a whole series of experiments based on the hull of Valkyrie 3, and he experiments and he experiments and he experiments until eventually he runs out of time. He's just got to build this Challenger. And in a lighter moment, he later remarked, I wish the Americans had had tank testing too, because he's so distracted by this data. But he builds Shamrock 2, and I think the greatest of course she loses, but I think the greatest testament to Shamrock 2 is after the 1903 America's Cup. Lipton sells Shamrock 2, and the New York Yacht Club put a little secret syndicate together, and they buy the boat and cut her up because they've realized she's potentially very successful and they don't want Lipton to use her again. But Lipton wants to challenge again for the America's Cup, and by this time Watson is not well, and he just doesn't have the energy to do it. There's a lot of speculation in the paper of will he, won't he, and he answers, if my health recovers, I'll do it. But in the end, his health doesn't recover, so Fife gets another go. Watson teaches Fife the tank testing technology, but Fife's not terribly interested in it. Watson also shares a lot of mast building technology with him, and Fife designs Shamrock 3, to my mind, absolutely the most beautiful America's Cup Challenger there has ever been. And of course, she doesn't win. After this big hiatus of extreme cutter, schooner building, and crazy lightweight boats, again, we kind of get a collapse in British yachting. People are just not willing to build these big cutters anymore. And people turn to schooner racing. For the same money as a big cutter, you can build a schooner, you can go on holiday on it, you can take your friends, you can go cruising, and you can also race in a less extreme kind of way. And this shows a new way forward. It's also heavily influenced by the Kaiser of Germany, who built his first schooner in 1903 in America. And she's kind of a cruisy schooner, not really a racing boat. And these guys are having great fun in the early years of the 20th century, and everything's going very, very well. But then the Americans turn up, and they build an extreme racing schooner, Ingomar, in 1904. Herreshoff design. She comes over to Britain, and just as Westwood would do a few years later, she completely annihilates the British racing fleet. And this is a challenge, and it's a challenge it would take a while to answer. And the answer first came from Germany with racing schooners, but eventually the British get there, and I will get there. But before that, we have to consider Charles Nicholson. He is far younger than Watson and Fife, but he's been designing yachts since the 1880s. But as the junior of the trio, he can never get a big order. Once Watson dies, he thinks, now's my time, and there's no one to build a big class cutter because the class is effectively dead. And then suddenly he gets wind of a guy, Robert Young, who might build a big class cutter. And he goes to see him and says, this is what we should do, and da-da-da-da-da. And the guy says, yeah, really nice to meet you, but there's only one designer in the country, and that's William Fife. See you later. And Nicholson says, no, I've got a better idea. We can do this, and we can show a whole new way forward in yachting. And eventually, he secures the order. And the new way forward in yachting is to build a big class cutter, Nerea, but to build it to Lloyd's Register scantlings. So this is a strong boat. And the economic rationale for this is that when the boat is superseded in racing terms, she'll still be strong, you can put a smaller rig on her, and you can sell her as a cruising yacht, because all the other big class cutters had no life after their racing life was over. And so the boat is built. She's pretty successful. Of course, she's heavy, but the most important thing about her is that she gives an example that would come in for the first international rule, the meter rule, where boats have to be built to Lloyd's Register R class or the equivalent. And the formula, you'll be used to it. Many of you are meter boat sailors, but the key thing, I think, is the introduction of this scantling rule, and a formula that has stayed in good stead, and people are still racing the boats. This formula and the adoption of Lloyd's scantlings gave a lot of confidence to people to build. So immediately we get two 23-meter class. So this is the new big class under the meter rule. And in the second year of the rule, we get a third one. So we have two Fifes and one Nicholson. And this is really the top class. And they started by really trying to get the big advantage from the girth measurement. Actually, I'm just going to go back and explain about girth measurement if I can. Can I go back? Yeah. So what you have here is both the G and the D measurements. So what they come up with is a girth following the skin and a straight line girth, and the D measurement is the difference at right angles between them. And what they're trying to do is prevent hollow boats being built. And this is really significant. So everyone is terribly scared of girth, and they build hulls to minimize girth, so these kind of relatively skinny things. And then they realize that actually, if you want to go fast, you should take a penalty on girth, and you should increase your sail area. So gradually, they pad the boats out under the waterline, they take a penalty, and they can increase their sail area. So in the winter of 1909, 1910, Nicholson has come to this conclusion, and he wants to put more sail area on his 23-meter Brynhild II, but he doesn't have enough time to build a new mast, or maybe the owner wasn't up for a new mast, and so he builds a section of a mast, about 4 foot high, and he places it on the mast step, and then they rig the boat with the other mast on top, and they go sailing. This is not successful. The mast falls off, the mini piece of mast goes straight through the bottom of the boat and sinks Brynhild II in one of the first races of the 1910 season. And a really poetic moment at the point when the whole sail plan is lying flat on the water, the owner who stepped off into a following support boat gets himself rowed over and takes his racing colors off the top of the mast, saying, "My boat may sink, but my colors will not," which I think is pretty stylish. But Nicholson wasn't all wrong on rigs. In 1912, he builds the 15-meter. So the 15-meter class are not the big class, but in many ways, they are the more active class, because about 20 of them were built, and you regularly get fleets of 7, 8, 9, 10 turning out to race. And with Istria, Nicholson has this great breakthrough, which is what we in England call the Marconi rig. And you can see on her jackyard topsail, we're missing the jackyard spar. He puts a track up the topmast, which is taller than an old topmast would be, and with that, he gets rid of weight aloft, and he gets a far better mainsail shape. Istria had all sorts of other technology in her, but that's the key technology that makes her a winner. And Nicholson is really on top of his game, and just as he thinks he is now the dominant one, the British go back into schooner racing, and this crazy guy, Cecil Whittaker, who's previously owned the Fife cruising schooner Sicily, decides to challenge the Kaiser in schooner racing. Remember that Germania has been built for the Krupps in 1908, and the Kaiser has built Meteor 4 in 1910. So the British really need to go out and beat the Germans. So the Fife schooner comes out, and she loses. And it's a national embarrassment. And her owner is not a nice guy. He's not going to just chalk it up and say whatever. So he doesn't talk to Fife anymore. He goes to Nicholson and says, "What can you do to make my schooner beat the Kaiser?" And he's like, Nicholson is like, "Well, I wouldn't have started from here." He said, "Yeah, we've got to do something." So he has to do some tweaks to the boat. They try some things. She goes back out in 1912, and it's not a success. She gets beaten again. So that winter, Nicholson goes to Whittaker and says, "Look, I've got another idea. And I know you don't want to build an all-new boat, but how's about I take the lead off Waterwitch, I take all the deck fittings, the hatches, the skylights, most of the rig, and I build you a new hull, and we reuse everything, and it won't cost you nearly as much as building a new boat." And surprisingly, Whittaker says yes. So Nicholson builds him Margarita. She is the biggest racing schooner ever built in Britain. She's 160 feet on deck. She's an absolute race winner. She scores first in every race she ever enters, apart from one where she broke a topmast. And British kind of yachting honor is restored. And everyone's pretty excited because the Kaiser then builds a Meteor 5. And this is going to be the German revenge. But before then, Nicholson's got to a kind of peak of success. And thanks to that, Lipton goes to him and orders the design and construction of Shamrock 4, his next America's Cup challenger. Now, Shamrock 4, you can see she's a pretty odd shape, cut-off stern, snub bow, big tumble home. She's the first boat built in Britain to the universal rule that would give us the J-class. And I want to talk about it in a bit more detail, because this boat, which when she challenged, eventually was the most successful challenger Britain had ever had. Of course, she did lose eventually. But this is a revolutionary boat that we have forgotten about. Here you have the Fife 23-meter shamrock and Nicholson's shamrock. You can see she's an extraordinary shape, but not just the shape, she's an extraordinary construction. She doesn't have conventional frames. She has a longitudinal framing system set up on aluminium bulkheads. She has double diagonal laminated construction with a longitudinal veneer laminate over. In fact, the best way to explain that is to look at the next vessel that was built in the same shed, which is this seaplane. This seaplane, you can see the diagonal laminate construction, and of course it's ultralight, because they then built aeroplanes like this. And they're building aeroplanes in a yacht yard because the First World War is about to break out, and they're hunting submarines. But before the war breaks out, Cowes Week, first week of August every year, everyone's super excited about the schooner racing. Margarita is there waiting for the Germans. Germania arrives, and Meteor 5 just doesn't arrive, which is a little bit surprising, but the Kaiser knows something we don't know. So the boats go home. Well, Germania doesn't get to go home because the British arrest her the minute the war's broken out and will turn a keel into bullets. Margarita goes back to Camper Nicholson's, and they can't even go to the big crane in the naval dockyard opposite, so they just chop the mast down. And the boat is laid up, and that is the end of big schooner racing. Meanwhile, Shamrock 4 is halfway across the Atlantic, hoping to challenge for the America's Cup. We don't have any photos there, but we do have a painting. And Nicholson comments that war at once obliterated the Shamrock, but I do not feel the regret I would have felt in any other circumstance. And 6 years later, he would get to challenge for the America's Cup with her. But that's the end of this part of the big class story, and it restarts after the war. The King fits out Britannia. We have the Bermudan rig 23 meters, and eventually the J-class era, and you have to ask me back if you want to hear about that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wow,